Everyone in Queensland will be choosing who they want to represent them in local council on March 16th. Along with councillors in their local electorate, all Brisbane residents will vote directly for who the next Lord Mayor of Brisbane will be. But do you really know who to choose and what each of the three candidates really stand for? To help you out, I arranged to interview all three candidates and ask them the exact same questions so that you can compare their answers and decide for yourself. The questions are not my own, but the questions on key issues subscribers of the Brisbane channel, along with other Brisbane community members, said were important to them. The three candidates each represent one of the major parties: Labor, the Liberal National Coalition, and the Greens. For the Greens, Jonathan Sriranganathan will be running. For Labor, Tracey Price, and the current Lord Mayor Adrian Schrinner will be running for the LNP. For these interviews, I did not share the questions with the candidates before I asked them, and I've included the answers given in full. As some may be quite long, I've divided the interviews into each question, so you can just skip to the issues you care most about. The first candidate for Lord Mayor that I interviewed was Jonathan Sriranganathan. By the mangroves just off the Brisbane River, I interviewed Jonathan on the top deck of his houseboat. Okay, well, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you, Adam.
Likewise. All right, so I'm going to jump into these questions. So these are not my questions pretty much. I've just asked the subscribers of the Brisbane channel and other people in the Brisbane community what they wanted to ask the candidates. And I'm going to ask all three mayoral candidates the same questions so that people can then watch the three videos and compare the answers.
Nice one.
So what motivated you to run for Mayor of Brisbane?
Yeah, so obviously I've been a city councillor for 7 years, and I guess part of what motivated me to run for mayor was this sense that there were a lot of things I would have liked to see happen as a city councillor, but we just couldn't get them through because we had an administration and a mayor that was pretty resistant to the kinds of changes I was advocating. So partly it was like, I think I could do a better job than the current mayor. Partly also though, it was because the platform of an election campaign is a really good way to disseminate ideas and prompt conversations about stuff. Even, regardless of whether you think you're going to win or not, it's a really good space to have interesting conversations about the future of the city. And partly I'm also running because I think my profile will help get some other Greens councillors elected. So I obviously want to win, but it's also really about that contest of ideas and prompting people to think differently about what kind of city we want Brisbane to become.
What do you see as the most important aspects of the role of mayor?
I actually think one of the most important aspects that doesn't get talked about enough is facilitating the community or the city to make its own decisions, because sometimes what happens to elected reps, and particularly to someone like the mayor, is that you've got lots of different stakeholders all trying to talk to you saying, I want this, you should do this, we need this. And I think what the mayor should be doing is putting more energy and effort into getting different groups and stakeholders talking to each other. So rather than everyone just kind of coming to the umpire or the judge and saying, hey, I want you to decide this and sort this out, we should be facilitating conversations across demographics and across interest groups so that the city can collectively work out what it thinks. And I guess related to that, I think the mayor has a really important role to play in kind of rebuilding democracy. Because to be blunt, I think our current system of representative democracy isn't working very well. I think decisions frequently get hijacked either by vocal minorities or vested corporate interests. And so that's a problem at all levels of government. But I think particularly at the local level, there's an opportunity where we can kind of, rebuild democracy from the bottom up, get people to practice different kinds of participatory decision-making, community voting, participatory design and collaborative processes so that people get more accustomed to making decisions themselves collectively with their neighbours and other people in the city. And once people get good at making democratic decisions at the local level, we can start to scale that up to state and federal levels. So I think, that's for me one of the big pieces of the puzzle, is that the mayor should be facilitating democratic discourse, not just functioning as a pure kind of service provision model where people come to the mayor and say, I want this, and then the mayor decides whether or not to give it to them based on who else is lobbying them.
What's your broad vision for Brisbane into the future?
Broadly, it's a city that's more sustainable and I guess more equitable. So probably doing something about this diverging inequality between the rich and the poor. But it's also a city that's more adaptable and resilient, because right now, even in terms of how we plan urban planning and transport networks, we're still quite reactive and we don't really think long term. There's all this talk of long-term planning, but they say long term and they mean 5 or 10 years. That's not really long term. I want us to be planning 50 years ahead and 100 years ahead, but still having the resilience and flexibility where if a disaster happens or there's some unforeseen economic shock, that our systems have enough redundancy that we can adapt. So yeah, it's creating a city that in some respects is less hierarchical and centralized. So less hierarchical, particularly in terms of decision-making power, so that ordinary residents have more control over the decisions that shape their lives, but also a city that's less centralized in terms of how services are provided and how infrastructure is structured. So for example, rather than having one big shopping mall or like one big library that everyone has to drive to from 3 or 4 suburbs away, let's decentralize more of that stuff. So you've got local businesses within walking distance, you've got services like community centres and libraries within close range of where people live, and taking that approach to transport networks as well. So we can talk more about this later, but our transport network is really focused around moving people in and out of the city centre, so decentralising that stuff, and also thinking more deeply about how we transform housing to not be treated as a for-profit commodity. So I guess, yeah, my vision for the city is pretty big and broad, and we can unpack it in more detail, but if I had to sort of really summarise it in a nutshell, it's a city that works for everyone and where everyone can enjoy a high standard of living while living sustainably, as opposed to the status quo where it feels like a few big businesses and a few wealthy people are doing really well and a lot of people are struggling.
Yeah, that kind of leads into the next question I have, and that is, how do you ensure that the council balances the interests of everybody when often those interests may even be at odds with each other? Like, how do you negotiate that?
I think this is a trap that sometimes politicians fall into, because they're trying to please everyone, and sometimes there is a genuine clash of interests, and if you try to please everyone, you end up sitting on the fence and umming and ahhing and you don't get anything done and everyone's still angry at you. So I think sometimes you just have to make a call and say, well, here's what I think is the right answer. I'm applying my values and the community's will to this problem. Here's what we're going to do. Sorry, you guys are in the minority on this one. You just have to cop it, and being willing to have those conversations. But I think it's also about recognizing that sometimes people feel like their interests are in conflict, or different stakeholders might appear as though their needs are conflicting because of the parameters that have been set on the decision. And so we see this in particular with, say, transport stuff, right? Where like you might have some pedestrians who are like, e-scooters should be banned because they're dangerous. And then actually what we could do is create separated lanes, like bike lanes, so that the scooters don't have to share the footpath with pedestrians. And that's a way of meeting everyone's needs, rather than saying, oh, we have to choose between space for pedestrians and space for e-scooters and bikes and stuff. And I think we see that in a lot of different spaces in terms of urban planning, where sometimes, particularly in public space, right, because there'll be lots of conflicts over how a park is designed and how much space we should have for the dog off leash area and how much space we need for the football fields. And the problem there is that there's just not enough green space in general. So rather than cramming all these uses and all these needs into one space, let's just argue for creating more public parkland. So I guess, yeah, sometimes what seems like a clash of interests can actually be addressed by broadening the scope of solutions and thinking a bit more laterally. And sometimes it's about recognizing that the corporate sector is, and I use that term generally, but like bigger corporations, they've got a very strong interest in their kind of own profit motive, and they'll convince the council that their interest is the general public interest. Oh, well, we're creating jobs or we're creating economic growth. That's in everyone's interest. And so then the council or other levels of government start to feel like, well, we have to do what this big business industry wants because that's what everyone wants. When actually, if we just ignored what the corporation was saying it wanted and it started talking to ordinary people, we'd find that actually most people out there all agree that this is the solution, and there's just this sort of one vested interest that's arguing for a different way forward. So yeah, I guess it is tough being an elected representative, and sometimes you do have these tricky clashes to resolve. But again, I've found in my work as a city councillor that if you get people talking to each other and create spaces for participatory and consensus-based decision-making, sometimes what seems like a direct clash of interests at first glance actually turns out there are other ways to solve that problem and meet everyone's needs. You just have to get people talking and do a good job of facilitating, because so many, whether it's public servants or politicians or professional consultants or whatever, they suck at facilitating decision making. And so they reinforce that kind of us versus them adversarial mentality rather than bringing people onto the sort of same side of a problem.
So if it comes down to it, and you do have to make decisions about who to please and who to say, well, you got to just deal with it.
Yeah.
Where are your priorities in that way?
Often, and this might sound like an easy answer, but often I think it is put the question to a vote. If there's something that's really controversial and it feels like the community is genuinely split and there are lots of competing voices that are all making good arguments, I think actually crowdsourcing the answer and saying, look, we're going to have a democratic vote, people are going to get the information they need to make an informed decision, and we'll see what the people decide, can often be a better approach. But for me personally, in terms of the values and priorities I bring to the table, climate change is really high on my radar as something we need to be doing more on. And so often I'll lean towards the solutions that are going to generate less fossil fuel emissions. So say in terms of transport, that's like, okay, lean towards active and public transport as opposed to private cars because of the fossil fuel emissions of private combustion engines. And similarly, I guess I lean towards social justice in terms of caring for the most vulnerable members of society. So I'm very strongly critical of the idea that in our society it should just be every man for themselves and dog eat dog world and don't worry about people who are struggling. My systemic critique revolves around the fact that society as it stands at the moment create situations where some people have a lot of privilege and can accrue wealth and power and influence while other people are left behind. So we kind of have a moral obligation to correct for those injustices. If everyone was genuinely starting from exactly the same baseline, then there'd be a little bit more legitimacy to those arguments of like, oh, we shouldn't interfere too much in the free market. But actually, it's not a real free market. It's a highly controlled and regulated government interventionist kind of system we're dealing with that creates inequities. So we have to be willing to correct for those inequities. And I'm thinking particularly about issues like housing justice, but also in terms of environmental stuff, we have to think not just about the needs of current generations, but future generations. So that idea of intergenerational equity as well. And those are big, tough conversations to have. But I think, yeah, the starting point is thinking about, are we leaving the world in a better state than we found it? And are we ensuring that everyone is benefiting from how our city changes and grows, or is it just a wealthy few? And that's been one of the core critiques and core messages of the Greens campaign, not just this time around, but in the time I've been a city councillor, is that the core problem right now for Brisbane, I think, is that so many decisions about transport and urban planning and even public space management are made essentially to satisfy the interests of big property developers, investment property speculators, a few big industries like freight companies and advertising. And those decisions kind of shape the city and shape the values of the people who live here. But we as residents actually don't have much say over those big decisions. So I think what we need to do is say we want to give ordinary people more control over the future of the city. We need to reduce the influence that property developers and other big industries have over public decision making. And we also need to make property developers pay their fair share towards the costs of infrastructure and services, because obviously Brisbane's growing rapidly. There are all these challenges and things we need to pay for and infrastructure projects we need. And right now, in fact, for the last decade or so, property developers have been making a huge amount of money off the construction boom and off the growth of Brisbane. They're making millions of dollars off the housing crisis, but they're only contributing a small fraction towards the costs of the infrastructure we need to cater for that growing population. So rather than getting into this mindset of, oh, how are we going to pay for this stuff? We have to choose between the bike lanes and the park upgrades, or we have to choose between the pedestrian crossings and the new library. Actually, we can have more of all of that stuff if we force property developers to pay their fair share and contribute a bit more towards the public purse. And the obvious counter argument to that is, oh, but if you make property developers pay their fair share, they'll pass those costs on to home buyers. The evidence suggests that that's not true, and we can, if you want, have a longer economic conversation about that. But actually what happens is that if you make property developers pay their fair share, that just puts a little bit of downward pressure on land values. And so if the costs of building go up a little bit, the cost that developers are willing to pay for land go down proportionally. So we can get developers contributing more towards the cost of public infrastructure without driving up housing costs.
So what's your assessment of the currently available public transport options, and what are planned changes or improvements?
I guess I'll start with the trains. They're a joke. They don't run frequently enough. Even like places like Sandgate and Wynnum, within the Brisbane City Council area, sometimes the trains are only running every half an hour, and that's a real missed opportunity, right? Like, we've got these rail corridors that could be carrying a lot more people. So definitely we need trains to be running more frequently, and alongside that, upgrading stations to make them fully accessible. That's really a state government issue, and it's something that within Brisbane City Council we don't really have a lot of capacity to do much about, but it's certainly something the Greens will continue pushing into the state election. The council manages the bus and ferry network on behalf of the state government, so the state government sets the ticket prices and kind of tells the council where they want the buses to go, and then the council operates the bus and ferry network as a contractor for the state government. And so when, like, there are lots of changes we want to make to those networks, a lot of that actually has to be negotiated with the state government, and there's always a bit of back and forth about who pays for the service improvements and that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, the Greens are proposing to increase the amount of money that council directly puts into the bus network. So already the council puts in a little bit of money and the state government puts in a lot of money and takes the fare revenue. So we want to up the council's direct funding commitment to create 15 new bus routes across suburban Brisbane. So right now, a big problem with both the bus and the train network is that it's very radial. A lot of services come in and out of the city centre. So even if you're trying to get sort of from one part of the north side to another, you've got to go all the way in and change and then come back out again. So we don't have those good direct connections between suburbs. And that's a big problem for Brisbane because not everyone works or goes to the CBD. A lot of people work in suburban commercial hubs or shopping malls or schools or other hospitals. There are all these big trip generators across the suburbs, and yet people are still having to transit via the city if they want to move by public transport. And as a result, heaps of people are driving. And so, for us, we've got this long list of 15 new bus routes that would connect different shopping centres and transport hubs and hospitals and university campuses without people having to go via the city centre. And all those additional routes intersect with the radial routes that run in and out of the city. So it kind of fills in a lot of missing gaps with the network. And then on top of that, we're proposing to increase the frequency of another 10 existing bus services. So there are routes like the 470 and the 192, different routes across the city that cater to pretty large catchments but don't run often enough. In some cases, they barely run at all on weekends. So we want to improve the coverage of the network by creating more bus services. We want to improve the frequency and the operating hours. And one piece of the puzzle to make that all viable is that we actually have to create more space for buses on the roads. There are some corridors where we actually have to say, sorry motorists, we're turning this into a T3 transit lane so that buses will have a bit more priority, but motorists can only use it if they're carpooling. Or in some cases, we actually have to turn some car lanes into actual dedicated bus lanes. And if we do that, that makes it a lot easier to run high frequency, reliable bus services, even during the morning and afternoon peak periods. So that's kind of a big overview of our public transport stuff. Alongside that, we think there needs to be a big intervention in terms of the cost of public transport, because buses, trains, ferries, they're really expensive in Brisbane compared to a lot of cities around the world.
Oh yeah.
And like
number 3, I think. In the world.
And there was a period where Brisbane was the most expensive. And I've heard people say, look, I wouldn't mind if it was that expensive if I felt like I was getting value for money, but it is both expensive and patchy and unreliable. But we've talked to a lot of people, and it's interesting. There's a big split in demographics in terms of, you'll talk to people who are, say, middle class or upper class, who have a little, socioeconomically, they're a little better off. For them, their problem is reliability and frequency and coverage. Whereas for people on lower incomes, the problem is cost. So we want to address the service quality, but also make it cheaper and ideally free. And closer to the council election, we'll be kind of announcing further plans around that stuff. But I don't see why public transport can't be free. There's a legitimate question about how much of that should be covered by the state government versus the federal government versus the council. But yeah, it actually saves money in the long term to make public transport free, because we can spend less money on road widening, we're reducing the number of people who are driving. There are all these positive social impacts and flow-on benefits. Even, for example, the fact that for a lot of younger people who get in trouble with the law, their first offence is like fare evasion, and they end up with a criminal record just because they didn't have the money for a bus ride. And so when you start drilling down into it, there are all these secondary benefits of making public transport free that would really transform the city, and particularly for people who are on lower incomes living in the outer burbs, to be able to move around more freely, and that you can get to the places you need to go and you can enjoy everything that the city has to offer without being paywalled out of that stuff, I think would be really transformational for a lot of people. So yeah, I guess that's a bit of an overview of public transport. I could go into a lot more detail. I'm really passionate about this stuff, but yeah, if people want more detail on this stuff, you can look up our policies on the website.
Yeah, and this kind of segues into one of the big concerns a lot of people, at least subscribers of the Brisbane channel, had with traffic congestion. So if you're building these bus lanes, then that's less space for cars. But then again, if public transport's more attractive, well, that could put a downward pressure on that. But how do you see the issue we have with traffic congestion changing?
Yeah, so I guess for people who haven't heard the term before, it's really good to look up the term induced demand, and basically that describes the phenomenon where if you create more road capacity, you're actually encouraging more people to drive, because at any given point in the day, there are some people who are making a choice. Some people have to drive, but some people are like, well, I could drive now, or I could catch the bus, or I could walk to a more local destination. So some commuters are always making choices about how they travel and when they travel. And if you free up more road capacity, people will fill that by choosing to drive. And we even see that in terms of spatial arrangements, where as we build wider roads, people feel comfortable moving further and further out. So continually widening roads actually accelerates that suburban sprawl problem we have in terms of urban planning. So conversely, if you reduce the amount of road space available to cars and give people good alternatives in terms of public and active transport, then actually some people choose the opposite. And they'll say, okay, I don't have to drive anymore because I've got a really good bike lane, or it's safe for me to walk to the shops or the local school or whatever. And so I think actually the solution to traffic congestion is, it's not spending more and more money widening roads and widening intersections and building more toll tunnels. The solution is to improve public transport and active transport, because you can move a lot more people in a bus or a train or even via bike lanes than you can moving the same number of people in the same space via cars. And again, the flow-on benefits are significant in terms of reduced fossil fuel emissions and the city's carbon footprint, but also social connection, because I think and I'm not the only person who says this, there's a lot of sociologists and urban planners who argue that when we're all traveling in our own little individualized bubble, our little metal car capsule, we're not interacting with our neighbors, we don't have kind of those spontaneous social interactions with random members of the public, and that actually reinforces a really individualistic kind of society. Whereas if people are walking or riding or indeed catching public transport, they'll have just a few more of those interactions on their day-to-day life where they remember that they're part of a community and they're interacting with other people. It's not just, I get into my car and then I drive to my workplace and then I sit at my desk and I don't actually interact with anyone who's not a co-worker for the entire day. So yeah, I'm going on a bit of a rant now, but really the solution to traffic congestion is better public transport, more investment in pedestrian crossings and bike lanes and other active transport upgrades that allow people to choose alternatives. And similarly, thinking deeply about how we orient and organize the city spatially. So part of the problem is, how do we move people from A to B? But we also need to think about how do we bring A and B closer together. So a big problem with the spatial design of Brisbane is that we have these big shopping malls, but not as many smaller commercial precincts that are well serviced. We have a few major employment hubs, and then everyone's traveling to those one or two places. So yeah, I talked earlier about decentralizing, whether it's services or commercial stuff or indeed like where people live. We need to spread around the services and embrace medium density live-ins with mixed use development so that people are closer to the things they need to get to on a regular basis. And so, yeah, urban planning and transport really go together hand in hand. You can't fix one without the other.
So that segues naturally into active transports, bikeways and things like that. So what's the plan there?
Basically, more pedestrian crossings, more bike lanes, more footpaths, more traffic coming to slow down cars on smaller residential streets. This isn't actually a very complex problem to solve. It's really a question of spending priorities, because right now the council just spends so much money widening roads and comparatively little money on active transport infrastructure. So we've released a list of 15 corridors that are our first priorities for bike lane infrastructure. We want to build 35 kilometres of new bike lanes over the next 4 years and 200 kilometres of new footpaths. And I think just the last couple of days we also announced that we want to create 200 new pedestrian crossings. And really what all that adds up to is a shift in who we prioritise. So every time there's an intersection point between like a road or a car and pedestrians, we want to say, let's start prioritising the pedestrians. Rather than pedestrians having to wait ages for the lights to change or having to wait for a break in a long stream of traffic, we kind of want to shift that around and say, well, actually, let's use zebra crossings and wombat crossings and signalised crossings so that it's the cars that have to wait a little bit longer and the pedestrians that have to wait a little bit less. And so, yeah, it's kind of about improving safety, but it's also about improving convenience, because there are lots of destinations, particularly in the inner city, but even in the middle and outer suburbs, that would be relatively quick to walk to if you didn't have to cross 3 or 4 busy roads. And so, yeah, shifting the priority at those intersections and conflict points would go a long way to making active transport more accessible. There's lots of other little things we can do in terms of, say, shade. I say little thing, it's quite a big thing really, like more shade trees along active transport routes. We've been talking about putting shade sails on the Victoria Bridge that links South Bank and the CBD. That's a really obvious one because it carries such high volumes of pedestrians and it's quite hot and exposed. So putting some shade over those bridges. But yeah, really the main game is the basic pedestrian infrastructure that the city is still lacking. Often I hear people say, oh, but not everyone can walk. Actually, not everyone can drive either. And there are lots of demographics for whom private vehicle transport is completely inaccessible. They're too young, they're too old, they have a disability of some kind, they can't afford to run a car, whatever it is. So many people will never be able to drive for transport. So we have to ensure that they can walk and ride and get to the train station or get to the bus stop. And in particular in Brisbane, active transport connections to schools are really poor in a lot of cases. And that means that kids who only live like a few hundred metres or a kilometre from school are being driven to the school gate when they could easily be walking or riding. And that's a huge generator of traffic congestion in Brisbane across the suburbs. And it's a self-reinforcing problem because if there's a lot of cars around the school, then other parents are like, oh, I don't feel safe letting my kid to walk to school, so they may drive them and then you have more cars. So one of the first priorities is improving active transport connections to schools and get to the point where the vast majority of kids are walking or riding to school rather than being driven. Obviously, some kids will have to be driven and some kids will have like big instruments for their music class or whatever that they have to carry with them. But most kids should be traveling to school via active transport. That's our priority. And that's the case in most of the world. Like Australia and the United States are a little bit unusual in terms of how car dependent children are. Whereas even in a lot of European cities and certainly a lot of Asia and Africa and Latin America, it's just accepted as a norm that kids will take themselves to school. Whereas here in Australia, mum and dad are kind of co-opted into being unpaid taxi drivers. That's disempowering for the children. It means they don't learn to move around the city independently, and it's a huge time burden on parents. So if we can improve those active transport connections to school, again, there are all these positive flow-on impacts for the rest of society.
Okay, population growth. Like Brisbane is Australia's fastest growing city. So what are your thoughts in terms of managing population growth, mitigating the negative effects of it, all of that kind of thing?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to planning and infrastructure provision. And I guess it's worth pointing out that Brisbane is indeed a very rapidly growing city, but it's also a very low density city. And so I think when people say, oh, population is a problem, we have to drill down a little bit into, okay, what are the manifestations of that problem? Sure, one is traffic congestion, and that can be solved with better public transport and medium density development close to public transport hubs. Similarly, some people blame population growth for the housing crisis. I think that's a bit of a simplistic explanation. Actually, housing is unaffordable because it's treated as a commodity, as a way to make profit. We have around 15,000 empty residential homes in Brisbane, thousands of empty houses and apartments that are sitting empty long term because a certain group of investors would rather leave them empty than rent them out cheaply. In some cases, those investors are developers who are waiting for approvals or are land banking, and sometimes it's people who are just holding onto the land for years, waiting for values to rise. But yeah, people blame population growth when actually there's thousands of empty homes and tens of thousands of empty bedrooms. So I guess like people are right to say, oh, population growth is causing these pressures, but let's be a bit more specific about, okay, what is the specific problem that we're pointing to and what are the solutions to that problem? In terms of impact on other infrastructure and services, like in the inner city now, rapidly densifying populations are even causing issues in terms of access to public green space. Like the parks are literally so crowded on weekends that there's not even room to kick a soccer ball and that sort of stuff. You know, I, as a councillor, had to deal with all these issues where people just wanted more dog off leash areas, and we're like, we literally can't find room for a dog off leash area in any of these parks. Again, though, like I said earlier, we just need more parks. And one of the answers to this challenge of a growing population is to embrace the idea of communal luxury. And that involves saying, well, look, not everyone needs a giant backyard and a big private pool, swimming pool all to themselves. If they have access to good quality public parkland nearby and there's a free entry public swimming pool down the road, then you don't need your own private stuff. And the same is true for libraries. The same is even true for entertainment spaces. If you have community centres and bookable halls and community facilities in the local area, and there's like bars and cafes and those third spaces that people go to, then you maybe don't need the giant entertainment deck or the sort of basement home bar kind of setup. Like you can have a smaller or more compact living style if you've got those public and communal facilities nearby. And so, yeah, when people say that population growth is a problem of space, I would say, well, we're just not using existing space very efficiently. And there are lots of cities that have much larger populations than Brisbane, much denser populations than Brisbane. They're navigating these challenges. And so I think I think sometimes when people are like, oh, population growth is a problem, I'm like, no. Crappy transport planning is a problem. The treatment of housing as a way to make money is a problem. You're blaming population growth because you don't want to address these deeper problems that go back to bad planning or crappy economic situations.
So that brings us to the whole rental crisis. So you've kind of touched on it. Well, what do you see Brisbane City Council being able to do? What different measures can help sort of ease a bit of the pressure in that area?
Yeah, I guess it starts by highlighting that the long-term goal is for housing not to be treated as a for-profit commodity. It's not good for society as a whole that some people are trying to make a lot of money out of housing while other people are struggling just to keep a roof over their heads. The problem is we've had decades of local, state and federal taxation incentives and policies that have encouraged people to invest in housing. So you've got particularly a class of landlords who feel like they're entitled to make money from investment properties, and their whole retirement plan is kind of bound up in that situation. But really, we don't want a situation where retirees who own investment properties, that their retirement is being funded by low-income tenants. People use the term self-funded retiree. You're not really self-funded. You're funded by a lower-income renter. So we need to transition away from that system without unfairly punishing or penalising individual investors. And the starting point, I think, is to put a temporary freeze on rent increases and say for the next 2 years, you can't put rents up. And we're not saying that you'll never be able to put rents up again, but just for the next 2 years, rents have risen so much. People are really struggling to afford housing right now. Let's just freeze rent increases for a couple of years, let things cool down, let wages catch up to housing costs, and then start to reevaluate. So that's one of the policies that Greens are taking to the council election, is saying, look, we want to introduce a 2-year rent freeze at the council level. As I alluded to earlier, we also want to introduce a vacancy levy and say to property investors, if you leave a home empty long term, we're going to charge you higher council rates, like way higher rates. And that would create a financial incentive for those investors to say, look, it's actually cheaper for you to rent this thing out than leave it empty. You might as well rent it out. And so those 15,000 homes I mentioned earlier, a lot of those would immediately transition to the rental market and increase the supply of rentals. Some of those homes might be sold and they'd be bought by first home buyers who then won't be other renters competing in the rental market. So between a rent freeze and the vacancy levy, we can put a lot of downward pressure on rents and housing costs. We've also talked about cracking down on short-term rental accommodation. There's a growing number of long-term houses and apartments are being converted into Airbnb investment properties. I've got nothing against someone renting out their spare room on Airbnb or temporarily renting out their home while they're traveling. But if you've got an investment property that is permanently being used for short-term rentals, it would be better for that to be made available as a long-term rental to a local family. So we also want to use rates incentives and planning changes to discourage that and encourage those homes to remain in the long-term rental market. We also need to see a massive increase in the construction of public housing, because that's really the core issue here, is that the vast majority of housing stock is privately owned and is operated for profit. If we have more public housing, then that competes with the private sector. It puts downward pressure on rents overall. It means that people who've been completely locked out of the private rental market can be housed in government housing. But the Greens' vision of public housing is that it shouldn't just be for people with extremely high needs or people on extremely low incomes. As many European cities have demonstrated, public housing can also be for the middle class. If you have really well-designed, well-located public housing where rent is capped and the rental revenue is collected by the government, that's better for tenants, but it's also a money spinner for the government, right? Like, I would rather that the government is collecting rent from people rather than private landlords or property investors or developers collecting that rent. So public housing can pay for itself. It doesn't have to be seen as this big cost burden on the taxpayer. If we start housing middle class people on their rents can cross-subsidise the housing costs of lower income people, and that helps, again, challenge the treatment of housing as a commodity. So yeah, again, if people are interested in our housing policy position, check out all the details on the website. There's so much to say on this, but it really starts by recognising that we are in a crisis, and that if we want to do something about this, and that actually house prices and rents are going to have to fall a little bit. We don't want to trigger an immediate property market collapse, but there's no way to address rising homelessness without somehow putting downward pressure on houses and rents. One way or another, whether you're building more housing or you're freezing rents or you're building more public housing, one way or another, housing costs and rents will have to fall if we are to stop more and more people sleeping on the street. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and it's one where it does feel like people's interests are a little bit more in direct conflict. But again, that's because we've created a system that pits landlords and tenants against each other, and it doesn't have to be that way.
So, Brisbane Olympics, what's your position there?
Back a few years ago, I was the only city councillor out of all the Labor and Liberal and Independent councillors. I was the only person who voted against Brisbane putting in a bid to host the Olympics. And I stand by that decision. Like, at the time, we were in the middle of COVID, and it was honestly kind of ridiculous that instead of addressing the urgencies of COVID and rising living costs, we had politicians travelling overseas to lock in an Olympics bid. Now it's sort of looking increasingly like we're stuck with the Olympics. And so I'm in this position of saying, well, I still don't think we should be hosting the Olympics at all. But if we are going to have to host it, let's make the best of it. In terms of transport planning, one of the problems with the Olympics, or with major events in general, is that the kinds of transport projects that are proposed are often focused on how do we move masses of people in and out of a stadium. Whereas, as I've talked about, that's actually not the transport solutions we need for Brisbane. Brisbane needs to decentralise our transport network and have more inter-suburban bus connectivity and move away from this radial stuff. So although people are like, well, the Olympics is good because it'll bring more transport infrastructure, I would argue that it's not necessarily going to bring the kinds of transport infrastructure the city actually needs long term. In fact, when you look into it, the Olympics isn't really creating much new transport infrastructure at all anyway. There were a few projects that were already in the pipeline that will complement the Olympics, but we're not actually getting any big new investment in transport infrastructure that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten in the city. And meanwhile, we are blowing billions of dollars on stadiums and other athletics infrastructure that we arguably don't need. So the biggest and most obvious one is the proposal to demolish and rebuild the Gabba. And I'm optimistic that the government's going to back away from that. It might even happen in the next couple of days or weeks. When they first announced that they wanted to demolish and rebuild the Gabba, as a local councillor for that area, I was like, this is a ridiculous proposal. Not only because it would displace East Brisbane State School right next door to the State Stadium, and that's a school that's growing, and we really need a school in that area because the population around Wollongabba is growing really quickly. So, you know, kicking out the school is a terrible idea to begin with. But the stadium itself is really, it doesn't have much of a footprint to play with in terms of it's bounded by Vulture Street and Stanley Street and Main Street and Wellington Road. There's not much space to expand it, so you've got a really constrained footprint, and any attempt to expand the stadium is going to run into some pretty hard limits, both above ground, but also in terms of drainage infrastructure and overland rain flow patterns underground. So there's like that whole area of Wollongabba used to be essentially wetland or swamp. Once you start excavating the foundations and building a new stadium there, the costs are going to be even more than the $3 billion that the state government's already announced. So at a time when the government is telling us that they don't have the money for better public housing or to make public transport free or to improve hospitals and schools, etc., when they say they don't have the money and resources for all that sort of stuff, it's ridiculous that they want to spend billions of dollars demolishing and rebuilding a stadium. And so I'm extremely critical of that particular project, but it also reflects a broader problem where the way the Olympics is being planned and envisaged isn't really thinking about the long-term interests of the city as a whole. It's about ticking the boxes so we can satisfy the International Olympics Committee and then making a lot of money for property developers and big hotel chains and tourism companies. I'm worried that the Olympics, in the way that they're currently being planned, they're not going to benefit broader Brisbane residents or small businesses. The commercial and economic benefits are largely going to flow to a few big companies, but ratepayers are going to have to pick up the cost long term. So I still hold out hope that it's possible to run kind of like a more egalitarian, maybe anti-capitalist kind of Olympics, but it would look very, very different to what's on the table at the moment.
And when you talked about, you know, the floodplain, I mean, Brisbane is basically a massive floodplain. So do you have plans for more efforts in terms of flood mitigation and resilience?
Yeah, and I mean, the first thing to point out is that we're often told that Brisbane is built on a floodplain. Actually, parts of the inner city are built on a floodplain, but most of Brisbane's suburban footprint is well above the flood levels. So sometimes, like, I hear politicians using this as an excuse. So they're like, well, Brisbane's built on a floodplain, what can you do? It's like, well, no, we have concentrated more development on the parts of Brisbane that flood. But actually, there's lots of high ground. There's lots of parts of the city where we could be developing without exposing more residents to flood risk. What's annoying is that because flood-prone warehouses along the river are really cheap at the moment, those are the sites where developers want to build, and they lobby the council to get approval for more high-density development in those areas. So the first step in flood resilience is to ban new development on highly flood-prone land. That's been Greens policy for a number of years now. And all the independent experts back that up. It's really just property developers and the major parties that want to keep cramming more people onto the floodplain. The reality is that, like I said, we've got plenty of other sites where we could be building more housing. There are suburban train stations and big sprawling parking lots where we could easily locate more medium density or even high density development. We don't have to be building so many new apartments on land that's vulnerable to flooding. Then there are some sites that are a little bit vulnerable to flooding. The water wouldn't get as deep or it wouldn't flow as far. In those areas, you can still build housing. You just have to design appropriately. So that means ensuring key infrastructure is above the flood levels, all the electrics, etc., are above the flood levels. It also means thinking a bit more deeply about where water flows. And there's some really good thinking around the idea of like blue-green infrastructure. So ensuring that there's enough green space to soak up stormwater, that there are detention basins and natural gullies where water can flow. There's a really good book, the Water Futures book by a Brisbane architect, I think it's James Davidson, and it goes into some detail about how we can redesign Brisbane to be more flood resilient. And it's full of great ideas. And again, this stuff is not rocket science. The problem right now is that property developers are driving decision making about where development goes and how it's designed. And we need to say, we cannot leave this decision up to property developers anymore. It's time to think about the long-term community needs, not the short-term interests of big business. And unfortunately, that means that even in some areas, we have to start relocating people. It's not enough to just stop building more housing in some of these areas. Some of these areas are so low-lying, they're so vulnerable to flooding, and in certain areas such as Brighton on Brisbane's north side, they're even vulnerable to sea level rise. A couple metres of sea level rise due to global warming, and there are whole neighbourhoods along Brisbane's Bayside suburbs that could be going underwater every high tide. So we need to have a long-term plan to relocate some of those flood vulnerable neighbourhoods to higher ground, and that has to be planned out over decades. We have to be saying, okay, in 50 or 100 years, we think this neighbourhood might go underwater. How do we start planning that transition now so that we don't have to force people to move 3 decades from now? And there can be benefits to that, of course, because if we do start relocating people out of those most flood-prone areas, we can also create more green space, more sports fields, more habitat for native animals. Like, there are these flow-on impacts. So it's a big challenge for the city, and right now we're making the problem worse by concentrating more development in these areas. But it's not an unsolvable problem. We just have to think long term.
How can Brisbane City Council under your leadership create more of a sense of community in Brisbane?
I've got so many ideas on this, and again, we don't have time to talk about all of it, but I think a lot more investment in the arts would be great. I'm not just talking about live music, but like community festivals and local visual arts and performing arts projects that are participatory in nature. So a lot of us, when we think of the arts, we think of something that you go to look at or that you sit down and watch, like a concert or whatever. But actually, I'm imagining more investment and support for artistic projects that actually involve wider participation, and like things like community choirs, for example. They're so good at building networks and there's so much you can do in that kind of context. But as well as supporting the arts directly, we also want to support more community projects, and this is, everything from bush care groups to like men's sheds to old school community centre models. The reality right now is that the City Council puts very little money into that sort of stuff. And even with sport, right? Like, some people say that sport gets too much public funding. I don't actually think it does. The problem is that so much public funding of sport goes towards the big stuff, like new stadiums or national footy leagues or whatever. We need to shift more of that funding back towards local clubs and community groups so that even people on lower incomes can participate in organised sport in some way. So to build community, it's more funding for sport and community arts. It's more funding for community building projects. Some of the specific ideas we've had include covering insurance costs for community groups, because there are lots of community groups where one of their big costs and their challenges of operating is just paying for public liability insurance. But the City Council already has this massive public liability insurance, and it wouldn't cost the council very much to auspice all those groups and say that, you can apply through this program and now the council insurance will cover you guys, rather than you having to take out an expensive private insurance policy. So there are ways that the council can reduce the operating costs for community groups that will make them more viable and sustainable, and will ensure that those kind of key volunteers who are really actively driving those projects don't have to spend as much time on paperwork and bureaucracy. And if those key volunteer organisers of these community projects can be empowered to spend more time on the actual project itself, then those projects can grow and include more people. I think as well, creating more spaces where people can interact is really important. So public spaces are often designed in such a way that you go there for a really specific thing, but you don't necessarily hang out there in general. So maybe even if you've got an outdoor gym, people going there specifically work on the outdoor gym and then they go home again. Or like there's a playground and you take your kids to the playground, then you go home again, or there's a dog off leash area. But we don't really design public spaces as places where people just hang out and linger and might interact with other people, or they might sit by themselves. There are some parks and squares that function in that way a little bit, but I think we could do a much better job in Brisbane of designing public spaces that support and facilitate community interaction, so that people, like some people might go to a bar to meet new friends or make friends with strangers, but we should be able to go to a park and meet friends and make new friends in the same way. And similarly, libraries are a really important space in terms of community building. And I'd like to see a world where our libraries are open much later into the evenings, and if you're like looking for something to do but you don't really like drinking, you don't have to go out to a bar at night for social connection. You could go to the library and there'll be activities there and ways to connect with people there. So I think the council has a really important role to play in community building, and it's often under-analysed and we don't talk about it enough. I guess again, so much more to say on this, but I guess I'd just add that the council really needs to come back to what's called a community development model, because so much of the way Brisbane City Council operates these days is kind of a service provision paradigm. It's like people pay rates and then we give them these discrete services in response. Whereas historically, and here in Brisbane, but also in other parts of the world, councils took a deliberate, intentional process of how do we build community, how do we support community projects to grow and to connect with each other. And there's a lot of community development theory and a lot of experts in this stuff who aren't really employed by a council, and that sort of thinking has been sidelined. But to really foster a sense of community development where there are experts employed by council and their job is to connect different community groups and connect lonely residents into community projects, so that anyone who's looking for something to do or wants to meet new people or is craving more social connection, they know how to find that really easily without paywalls. And I think if the council did more of that sort of stuff, it would be really transformational for Brisbane's culture and its sense of identity.
What kind of culture within Brisbane City Council do you think would be most conducive to getting things done? And how are you going to build that kind of culture within Brisbane City Council?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this one as well. I think in general, and I emphasise that it's in general, but in general I think Brisbane City Council's administration and the public service is too risk averse. And that's evolved for a couple of reasons. One is that if ever something goes wrong, like, someone gets injured because some playground had sharp edges or whatever, there's a real risk, or there's a perceived risk, that the other political parties will really attack whoever's in charge and be like, oh, this person was injured, it's your fault. And so people are so worried about being criticised and attacked, and they're worried about, losing their jobs or whatever. So they become really risk averse, and that drives up costs on projects because everything needs to be like quadruple checked, and sometimes we have overly burdensome safety regulations. Again, I'm generalizing a bit. Safety regulations are important, but it also means that there's not an appetite for risk in terms of trying new stuff. And I would argue that the current City Council administration, in terms of the Liberal National Party, is particularly conservative and reluctant to try new things. Even with, say, bike lanes, like I had to argue really hard to get some of the separated bike lane projects that we've seen rolled out in Brisbane over the last couple of years. People might know on Elizabeth Street in the CBD, we've recently rolled out separated bike lanes. And the core of the project was not actually that complex or costly. It was just like sticking down some simple physical barriers between the bike lane and the car lane. Other cities have been doing this for years, but when I said, hey, Brisbane, let's do this, both the LNP councillors and some of the senior public servants were like, oh, no, it's not that simple. Turns out it was that simple. It was just like they weren't in the habit of doing it. And I think that, I guess, really bugs me in general. Part of the problem as well is this general sense of like treating residents like idiots. Like there are a lot of public servants, again, not all of them, but a few too many, who think that the general public are all buffoons who can't be trusted to make good decisions. And I understand where that comes from, because if you give people a really narrow range of options and you don't give them much information, all you get is these vocal objections. No, we don't want that to happen. Whereas if you empower people, you give them more information, you involve them collaboratively and meaningfully in decision making, then actually like people are intelligent enough to make good decisions. But unfortunately the council, a lot of people in the council are like, oh, we can't trust residents with that. They would make a silly decision, or they're too incompetent, they'll hurt themselves if we do that. So I guess in a nutshell, challenging that risk-averse culture and empowering the public servants within council who do have good ideas to say, look, let's try that, let's experiment, let's trial this. We don't always have to lock in a particular way of doing things for the next 50 years, or we don't have to design this project permanently. Maybe we want to redesign this streetscape and we're not quite sure exactly how it should be designed. Let's try stuff. We'll put out some big concrete temporary pot plants and some signage and some paint, and we'll see how this different spatial arrangement works. And then if it works, a few years later, we can put in more permanent concrete edges and redesign the space on a long-term basis. So yeah, I guess fostering a culture of try it and see, and trialing things and flexible approaches. Some people use the term tactical urbanism in terms of urban design, where we sort of, try stuff temporarily, adapt and respond and learn from how people use the space and then make changes. And I think if the council did a little bit more of that, that would be really cool as well. And like I said earlier, fostering a culture of community development as opposed to pure service provision, I think would be really powerful as well. But yeah, I've got lots more to say on that stuff. I guess if people are interested in this, come along to one of our events and ask me more questions about it.
You also mentioned that adversarial kind of thing of the different parties basically being very focused on bringing the other one down. Not being brought down by the other one. How do you combat that?
I mean, that was a big frustration of mine in the 7 years I worked as a city councillor, because I always went into the council chamber with the genuine intention of taking people on good faith and trying to have meaningful conversations. And even in question time, when I stood up to ask a question of the mayor, I wasn't trying to trick them or back them into a corner. I was like, here is a genuine question. What's your actual response to this? But I think both the Labor and Liberal politicians are so trapped in this adversarial mentality that even when someone comes to them with what is a reasonable evidence-based critique or a genuine good faith question, they interpret it as an attack. And I think that has evolved over many years, but partly it's reinforced by the fact that ideologically and philosophically, there's not that much that separates Labor and the LNP in terms of their vision for the future of the city. There are some notable differences, but there aren't dramatic differences between the two parties in terms of what direction they want the city to go in. And so when actually you're kind of on the same page, but you're competing for votes and power, it sort of forces you to turn little arguments into big arguments. And I've seen that happen particularly with like heritage laws and housing protection and all sorts of stuff, where a really small disagreement gets blown up into this big thing because they've got nothing else to argue about. But partly it's a problem of a majoritarian decision-making system, because under a representative democracy, if you control 51% of the seats, you control 100% of the power. And what I would like to see happen long-term in Brisbane is that we try to shift towards more consensus-based decision-making. So rather than everything being put to a vote and the loser just losing out all the time, we spend more time talking through decisions and getting to a point where everyone can agree, but also short-circuiting the us versus them party adversarialism by putting more stuff to a public vote. So right now, Labor and LNP councillors will just argue and argue and argue over a thing for days and days. Whereas if you just said, all right, let's put it up to a vote, see what the people want. Oh, the majority of residents want this. Cool, let's do that. It kind of neutralizes that us versus them mentality. There are even simple things that we could do in terms of how the council chamber itself operates and is administered. Because like we sit all the Labor councillors on one side and all the LNP councillors on the other, reinforces that kind of football team mentality. If we broke up that seating arrangement and everyone was sort of sitting together, I think that would reinforce a certain collegial, collaborative mindset. Even like people wouldn't know this, but during the afternoon tea breaks in a council meeting, the Liberals have their own room that they go into, and then the Labor guys have their own room, and I as a Greens councillor have my own little office. And I'll sometimes hang out in the shared kitchen space and try to talk to other people, but everyone's like going off into their own like territories. And so, yeah, again, like if we all had just one big break room where we all hung out together rather than these separate rooms where we're plotting against each other, I think that would help too. I could go on about the role of the media and the role of big business in playing people off against each other. There's so many elements to that. It's a really big challenge. But yeah, I guess my goal is to try and create a council where rather than it being like administration versus opposition, we're all just there for the public good, and we have disagreements, but we learn to disagree respectfully, and we don't turn everything into a kind of point scoring exercise.
What's something you respect about the other two candidates?
Yeah, really good question. To be honest, I don't know Tracey Price very well. Like, she hasn't been a councillor before, and I've never worked with her. So for me to say, oh, I really like this about her is going to seem a little bit shallow. Like, I've met her a couple of times. She's really polite and personable. She seems like her heart's in the right place. So I have no reason to disrespect her, but I can't say I know her very well. In terms of the Lord Mayor, I guess I respect the fact that he has mostly been respectful to me when we've like interacted face to face. Like, he's certainly said some nasty things about me in the media and in other contexts, but I think genuinely we've always been able to have like respectful face to face conversations, and I'm really grateful for that because he doesn't have to do that, right? He could just completely ignore me. I also respect the fact that he really cares about his family and what he sees as the community. He like, I don't think he's an evil person. I don't like, I don't think he's like in it for himself. I think he's trying to do the right things for the city, but he's been manipulated by big business and has been so risk averse that he doesn't want to try new things. But I think his heart's in the right place, and I respect that about him, even though I really strongly disagree with a lot of his policy ideas.
With the cost of living pressures people are feeling, do you see council rates increasing in the near future?
To be honest, I think rates should increase a little bit for certain kinds of commercial and industrial land uses. So, for example, inner city parking lots, they have a big impact on the city's infrastructure costs because they're attracting all these cars to drive into the city, and that's driving up our road maintenance costs. And the rates bill to run an inner city parking lot is really low. The same is actually true for really big warehouse style businesses. So thinking about like IKEAs and Bunnings, these are businesses that are making massive profits, and they have a really big impact on the transport network because so many people are driving there as customers, but also big trucks are driving there to transport goods. Those businesses, their rates bills are also quite low, I think. So I don't think we need to be increasing the rates of ordinary owner-occupiers and residents, but I think there's space for rates reforms around some of those particular commercial activities. And there might also be an argument for increasing the rates on activities like golf courses and horse racing, because again, these are land uses that are very inefficient. These activities take up so much space within a city footprint where space is at a premium. So like charging slightly higher rates would encourage those land uses to be a bit more efficient, and we could start to make them pay their fair share again. So yeah, short answer is no, I don't think we need to put up residential rates, but I definitely think there are certain commercial activities and land uses where we could jack up the rates a little bit and make those industries pay their fair share. I would also argue that there are certain businesses where I would like to increase the rates so much that they become unviable. And one of those is weapons manufacturing. I think weapons manufacturing is fundamentally unethical. I don't think we need to be manufacturing tanks and missiles in Brisbane, but there are a few weapons manufacturing companies around. Let's charge them really high rates. They can pay for our roads and footpaths if they really want to stay in Brisbane.
Okay, so let's get to the really big issues, the ones that are really divisive and that may be the most controversial. Where do you stand on these things? Pineapple on pizza,
Ooh.
yes or no?
I'm not a pineapple on pizza fan. I'm sorry. I'm a no on that one.
Okay. Ibis or Curlew?
Oh man, now you've really, like we've put the Ibis and bush turkey on our flyers as our little campaign logo, and I've always had a soft spot for the Ibis. So I guess I'll lean towards the Ibis because it is a more subversive and like disruptive character. I love the Curlew as well, but there's something about the Ibis it's like a big f you to the city establishment, right? Like it just always subverts and co-ops like these establishment processes and systems in interesting ways. So yeah, I think I'd go with Ibis.
Okay. Vegemite in the fridge or in the pantry?
I think we've started putting it in the fridge. I don't even know why. I think at some stage some kind of insect got in there, but I don't feel strongly about that one. Whatever works for people.
Okay, cool. And if people want to know more, where do they go for more information?
So and I guess I'd point out that this is different to the two major parties, but we actually published our entire policy platform on the campaign website. So jonathansri.com, you can see there we've got our full policy platform. We've got a list of our key priorities and a lot of detail about some of the initiatives I've talked about today. The website's the best place, but you can also follow me on social media. I'm on all the channels, so track down Jonathan Sriranganathan and yeah, see what we've got to say. I know there are a lot of people out there who are like, oh, I'm not usually a Greens voter. I've heard the Greens are a little bit extreme. I encourage you to actually look at the details of what we're talking about, because a lot of the stuff we're proposing is not radical at all. It's they're ideas that have been tried successfully in other cities. They're common sense responses to the challenges we're facing. And I think really we need to be doing things very differently to the way we are currently. There are some really big challenges on the horizon. We can't just keep persisting with the status quo. So check out our ideas, and even if you've never voted Greens before, at least take the time to consider us seriously and have a look at our policy platform.
Yep. Cool. Well, thanks for your time.
Thanks for the chat. It's been a pleasure. Cheers, Adam.
Yep.